Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's first webinar in this three-part series called Borderlands, hosted by the Yellowstone Gateway Museum. My name is Diane Chalfant, and I'm a volunteer and board member of the Yellowstone Gateway Museum here in Livingston, Montana. Our museum is a tremendous resource for our community, and so much of it can be accessed online. Beyond these webinar programs, the Yellowstone Gateway Museum also offers a fascinating digital photo archives, online exhibits, and research services. So if you're not currently a member, we really encourage you to become a member and explore more about the rich natural and cultural heritage of Park County, Montana. In a moment, I'll introduce the museum's curator, Reinhardt. But first, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so that you'll know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions. And you'll be able to submit them to today's presenter, Jessie Logan, and your questions will be anonymous. To submit a question, just type your question in the Q&A at the bottom of the control panel. And Karen and I will read the questions and then we'll share them with our speaker. As time allows, Jessie will answer as many questions as he can after the presentation. We will be recording the webinar and we'll upload it to Yellowstone Gateway Museum's YouTube channel after the event. And finally, following the webinar, you'll have an opportunity to take a very short survey. We hope you'll take that survey because we'll use the results to help us to continue to improve this webinar series and other programs. I'd now like to introduce Yellowstone Gateway Museum's curator, Reinhardt. Karen?
Thank you, Diane. Before I introduce Jessie this evening, I invite you all to register for upcoming Borderlands programs, which occur on 2 more Wednesday evenings this fall. On November 10th, Mary Murphy presents Ivan Doig, writer of Montana's Land and People. Doig captured Montana landscape and the Montana voice in his novels, but his own voice was born just to the north of Park County in Marr County in his beloved memoir, This House of Sky. On November 17, John Axline presents The Beartooth Highway, a history of Montana's most beautiful drive, a story of how the highway came about and the story of the men who designed and built America's most scenic highway. It connects Cook City and Red Lodge, Montana. We hope you will join us for both of these programs, but now sit back, relax, and enjoy Montana history. So now to introduce tonight's speaker. Jessie Logan spent the first half of his career in academia at Colorado State University and Virginia Tech. He finished as a research scientist for the U.S. Forest Service in Logan, Utah. After retiring in 2006, he moved to Montana with his wife, Catherine. They summer an immigrant and winter in Cook City, where he works as a backcountry ski guide for Yellowstone ski tours. Jessie has published over 100 scientific articles and more recently, numerous essays regarding the wilderness experience. He was associate and contributing map editor for Voices of Yellowstone's Capstone, a narrative atlas of the Absaroka-Beartooth wilderness. This book won the 2020 Big Sky Award and an Independent Publisher Book Awards Gold Medal, and was a High Plains Book Award finalist. It is a beautiful book, has great stories, and I trust that Jessie will let us know where we can obtain our own copies. Please welcome Jessie Logan.
Well, thanks a lot, Karen. I appreciate that nice introduction. And, you know, it's always a pleasure to talk about this very special place, the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness area. And let me share a screen here. We should be good. And when Karen first contacted me, she indicated that my theme is borders, and I am looking for a presenter with let me get some things arranged. Looking for a presenter who can speak about lines or borders that humans have drawn on a map. So that's really going to be the theme of what I'm going to talk about tonight. And if we would take a look at a map of our area when William Clark camped near Livingston in July of 1806, it might look like this, fairly unencumbered. Of course, you know, humans had occupied this area long before Clark's time, at least 13,000 years ago, and perhaps much longer. A recent discovery of footprints in New Mexico and the White Sands National Park pushes that back maybe 21,000 years ago. But there were flexible boundaries, really not set barriers. And in Shane Doyle's words, the new Montanans had enough infrastructure and military to assume control over the once wild and untamed landscape, and the final human dominoes in the hunting, gathering, and trading culture of the Medicine Wheel country began to fall, and fall they did. If we would fast forward and look at the same map today, it would look quite a bit different. 200 short years really after William Clark's camp. You know, and what we see on the map is a combination of arbitrary but meaningful boundaries like state lines, more landscape-driven boundaries like national parks, national forests that are shown in the dark green, and then wilderness areas that are shown in the light green. And then some of the lines are on the ground as well as on the map, the roads. So when I look at this map, there are two interpretations. One is just how fortunate we are in Park County to have something so unique right at our doorstep. It's truly the wildest remaining country in the contiguous US. And it's, you know, it's right out our back door, our front door. And the second thing I see in this map is the impacts of humans during the last 200 years. If we, you know, consider the total time humans have occupied North America, that's really 1/100th of the time humans have been here, and yet we've had this impact. And I would also point out in red, outlined in red, the Absaroka-Beartooth or Absaroka-Beartooth wilderness area, which is really going to be the topic of my talk tonight. And if I now superimpose Park County, the borders of Park County, we can see that in a very real sense, this is our wilderness. At least the Absaroka half of the Absaroka-Beartooth wilderness area is in Park County. And, you know, the important aspects of this wilderness area to Livingston, if we just look south, the skyline is dominated by the namesake mountain Livingston Peak. If I look out my bedroom window every morning to the east, I see the rising sun coming up over the Absaroka-Beartooth. And in winter, when we're in Cook, I spend, you know, many days skiing up into the wilderness. So, you know, in many ways, it's not only our wilderness area in some sense, we have a personal attachment to it, but it in many ways defines what Park County is really about and why so many of us have been drawn to this area. You know, so considering the central importance of the Absaroka-Beartooth wilderness to our region, a few years ago, Trouty Perry and myself independently decided to put together a book about this incredible place. And I really feel honored to have had a hand in the development of this atlas, the narrative atlas, and more than a little proud of the part you know, we played in this, I played in this award-winning book, but it was really, is and was a team effort As I mentioned, Trouty had just retired as district ranger on the Red Lodge district, and I had just spent a couple of seasons as on the board of directors for the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness Foundation, and we were both interested in trying to pay back some of the values that we get from this really incredible place. And so one motivation was to raise funds for the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness Foundation, and all proceeds from the sale of the book go to the foundation. But when we were casting about trying to come up with the vision of this book, we began to contact people, and the response was really quite remarkable. There's really a deep sense of belonging and ownership to the Absaroka-Beartooth. So people responded enough that we were able to convince donors that we were really serious, and we had a good chance of producing something, and it was worth their support, which they provided us enough support so we could hire the professional help we really needed in the way of Scott McMillian, his expert editorial help, capacity. Scott recommended Adrienne Pollard for the layout. He had worked with her, and when I heard that Adrienne was responsible for Tom Murphy's books, that was recommendation enough. And then Elise Atkinson, her copy editing skills have kept us all honest. But in addition to this core team, which is really Livingston based, where we're over 100 contributors in the way of writers, artists, photographers, all of whom donated their talent and time to the production of this book. So it's really a community effort in the sense of community and belonging that I really feel grateful to. So, hopefully you'll pick up a copy of this book in your local, independent bookseller, or at the Gateway Museum. And probably the first thing that'll catch your attention is, it's a beautiful book. Adrienne did really a spectacular job with the layout, and the visual impact is much like that the Beartooth itself, as the characterization of the Beartooth Highway as America's most beautiful drive is quite true. I'm sure any place else it would be a national park. And as pointed out, John Axline is going to be talking about this, about the Beartooth Highway in the third talk in this series. So, you might think this would be a welcome addition to your coffee table books. But, if you do pick up the book and cherry pick an essay or two, you'll find that it's really much deeper than the typical coffee table book. The essays, the voices of the capstone really have something important to say, and many of them in a profound way. So in the same sense that the Beartooth is much more than just scenery, this book is more than a typical coffee table book. And that's what we attempted to capture in our book. So let's take a look a little deeper. One of the challenges that Trouty and I faced was how do you integrate these 30 different essays into a coherent voice? Hopefully we'd have more than just a collection of essays. There's a story of wildness and wilderness that we were really interested in getting across in some cohesive fashion. And one thing that we settled on was the role of maps as a unifying theme. And it is an atlas after all. So there is a collection, 30 maps, one adjoining each of the essays, and it's an organizational paradigm. And one way to look at it, I suppose, would be collection of 30 different maps, but an alternative way would be one map with 30 layers, each with their compelling story. And, of these 30, it's no easy task to try and pick the ones to include in a 40-minute talk like this evening. But in sticking with the Borderlands theme of this speaker series, I'm going to consider those that, in Trouty's words, our intention with this atlas is to reflect that visceral need for humans to be engaged with the natural world through time. What is gained and what is lost when we see it as separate. Boundaries don't reflect the nature of the holistic system. Wilderness is more than just a place you go to get away or a destination on a checklist. The essays in this atlas demonstrate what we do outside wilderness affects the resources within, and what happens in wilderness matters to us immensely. In that sense, the boundaries are meaningless. In other words, tonight I'll focus on 3 separate essays that expand beyond the arbitrary borders drawn on the Absaroka-Beartooth map. First, I'll talk about an essay that Shane Doyle wrote. As I previously noted, the human voice on this landscape vastly predates the time of European occupation. And Shane's essay speaks to this pre-European heritage. As he wrote, the new Montanans had enough infrastructure and military to assume control over the once wild and untamed landscape. And the final human dominoes in the hunting, gathering, and trading cultures of the Medicine Wheel country began to fall. The Montana reservations established by the 1851 and the 1868 Fort Laramie treaties shrank like snowballs in the summer sun. The Absaroka-Beartooth Mountains guaranteed to the Crow tribe in not one, but 2 treaties became casualties of manifest destiny. So to get an idea of what Shane is speaking to, if we take a look at a map of the 1851 boundary established at the Laramie Treaty, it was almost immediately broken by the 1868 Laramie Treaty, but it still included the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness. Once again, it was reduced in 1882, still connected, but only somewhat superficially. Finally, in 1891, the boundary of the reservation was completely apart from the historic homeland of the ABW. And finally today, that's what the boundary looks like. So about these shrinking boundaries, Shane wrote, Sarah's life movements would echo the reservation's shrinking boundaries. Born on the northern boundary of the reservation, she married at the first agency, raised her 7 children with Tom near the second agency at the confluence of the Stillwater and the Yellowstone rivers, and died and was buried at the third agency, at Crow Agency, in the early 20th century. So Shane's talking about her great-great-grandmother, Strikes the Gun, or also known as Shara Shane, shown in the photograph here. Tom, this photograph was taken by Jay Haynes in 1880. So Shane's great-great-grandparents were shown. And he goes on to say, the life of my great-great-grandmother, like so many of her contemporaries, played out in the shadow of the Absaroka-Beartooth Mountains. These traditional people knew and loved the mountains and were linked to them in both physical and metaphysical ways that few of us will ever be able to comprehend. He goes on to say, the sacred prayers and the plentiful spiritual and physical medicines are still cradled in the mountains. And though memories fade with each passing generation, they will never disappear. So Shane's essay is not only about the cultural heritage that was lost, but how it is, the process of regaining this heritage, reconnecting through these sacred lands. So in Shane's words again, for the Absaroka people and for anyone else who seeks them out, the opportunities to reconnect with the indigenous homeland and with a ceremonial people's birthright still live in the earth, the rocks, water, and wind of the mountains. It's all still there, Aho. So that's an eloquent way of stating Thoreau's thoughts in Wilderness as the preservation of the world. And Shane is really an interesting person. I should probably say Dr. Doyle. He's an archaeologist, traditional singer, storyteller, champion of indigenous culture. And there is a really interesting lecture interview with Shane on the Anzac Clovis Boy on the YouTube channel for the Gateway Museum, and it's well worth taking a look at. So, you know, the lessons in that are, I think, really important to us. A second essay I'd like to talk about tonight brings us to the grasshoppers, the part of the title to my presentation. They're not really grasshoppers, they're locusts. And Jeffrey Lockwood's compelling essay contains this quote: "A blizzard sweeps over the horizon and the sky fills with swirling flakes, but the fields are green and the breeze is hot. As you wrestle with incongruity, the sparkling snowflakes transform into voracious locusts, and your confusion transforms into terror. A fluttering insect strikes your face and then pelts your body, and soon hundreds envelop you in a vortex of papery wings. Through the maelstrom, you see your crops melting away beneath a bristling blanket of locusts." And it goes on: "Imagine being in the midst of the largest congregation of animal life that the human race has ever known. Picture yourself in Plattsmouth, Nebraska in the summer of 1875. A swarm of Rocky Mountain locusts flowed northward for 5 days, creating a biological eclipse of the sun. It is a super organism composed of 35 trillion individuals. Before the year is up, subsistence agriculture across the Great Plains will be decimated, and US troops will be mobilized to distribute food, blankets, and clothing to disparate pioneer families." So 35 trillion is 3.5 followed by 12 zeros. It's a big number. To get an idea of the abundance of this most abundant animal in the history of the human experience on Earth, when most people would be asked about the most abundant animal pre-European occupation of North America, they'd probably say bison. And there were a lot of bison, maybe between 40, 60 million bison at the time of Lewis and Clark. And if you say assume 40 million bison with an average of 1,200 pounds each, that's 24 million tons of biomass. But if you take 3.5 trillion locusts, that results in about 27 million tons of biomass. So not only in numbers was this, you know, a huge mass, a huge super organism, but in biomass, it also rivaled bison. It's pretty amazing. So some years out of, you know, when conditions were right, these biblical scale hordes would come roaring out of the mountains, consuming essentially all vegetation in their path. So another quote: "By clocking the insect speed as they streamed overhead, and by telegraphing to surrounding towns, Dr. A.L. Child of the U.S. Signal Corps estimated that swarms was 1,800 miles long and at least 110 miles wide. Had it been formed into a rectangle, the suffocating mass of insects would have blanketed Wyoming, and Colorado. So as incredible as all this might seem, as Jeff wrote, if we find it difficult to envision such a massive life, it is even more challenging to grasp that within 30 years of Dr. Child's account of the largest insect swarm ever recorded, this species disappeared forever. The last living specimen of the Rocky Mountain locust was collected in 1902 on the Canadian prairie. So think about that. The most abundant animal in the history of humans on Earth became extinct in a matter of decades. So that posed a really interesting question. And when I studied this, when I was a student in college, that an unanswered question: did the Rocky Mountain locust truly become extinct over this short period of time? Or alternatively, was it just the migratory phase of a common abundant grasshopper, Melanopus sanguinipus? It's a range pest. And that was a really legitimate question. People just found it so hard to comprehend that this mass of animals could become extinct in such a very short period of time. So all this is really is interesting, but what does this all have to do with the Absaroka-Beartooth wilderness? Well, there are 10 named glaciers in the Beartooth, and of these, one is named Grasshopper Glacier, and there's another named Hopper Glacier. And the reason for these names is as grasshoppers in the summer fly over these cold air masses, they become inactive, fall down on the surface, and are entombed in the in the snow, in the glacial surface. And in historic times, near recent times, really, it would be just modern grasshoppers, because you'd be looking at the surface of the glacier. But with a warming climate, and as these glaciers recede, as shown in this drawing of Jonathan Marcus's of Grasshopper Glacier, the glacial ice is lost and the contents become available on the surface. So Jeff thought, aha, as these glaciers melt, might there be Rocky Mountain locusts entombed and now exposed in the glacial mass? So he started looking, and he started on the Beartooth with Grasshopper Glacier and Hopper Glacier. Eventually, he was successful in recovering Rocky Mountain locusts that he could extract DNA from and establish, yes, this truly was a separate species that had unbelievable numbers that became extinct in a matter of decades. So he goes on to write, but if we pay careful attention, the Rocky Mountain locust has lessons to teach us about the abundance and extinction, along with our tendency as a species to stumble like bulls through nature's china shop. Perhaps most importantly, the story of the locust has troubling implications for contemporary society and provides warnings about our future on a rapidly changing planet. And that's a pretty philosophical statement. And Jeff's an interesting guy as well. He started off, he was hired by the University of Wyoming in the entomology department as a range entomologist looking at grasshoppers. He is now in the philosophy department. So perhaps that's explains his bent and this essay. It's really fascinating reading. To the story, I'd add a couple of notes. First of all, critical habitat for this particular creature extended far beyond any contemporary boundaries or borders. The real key to the loss, the extinction of the Rocky Mountain locust, Jeff has attributed to the change in agricultural practices that disturbed their breeding areas with the breaking up of the plains, and particularly the areas close to the mountain fronts. Another point I think is really important and speaks to me at least is population numbers by itself can be almost meaningless as an indication of ecological health or sustainability. And I think this is really an important thought to keep in mind when we think about threatened and endangered species. Often there's a target population that, once the species reach, they can be considered no longer threatened. And really without considering the real ecological health of the species, that can be almost meaningful. And of course, the link between ecosystems, currently we might think of the link between the Great Plains and the high mountains with noctuid moths and the important food resource they are in the scree fields, the high scree fields for grizzly bears. So the last thing I would like to talk about is Scott McMillan's article on grizzly bear haven. And Scott writes, because most of us are careful in the Absaroka-Beartooth, is probably the safest place in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem for grizzlies. Between 2015 and 2018, nearly 250 bears died in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, mostly by human hands, but none of them were in the Absaroka-Beartooth. Some of the reasons were straightforward. The Absaroka-Beartooth is wilderness, so roadkill isn't a factor. The last domestic sheep allotments went away in 2003, removing a huge temptation for hungry grizzlies. And remaining cattle allotments total only a few thousand acres around the edges of the wilderness. Rock and ice dominate much of the Absaroka-Beartooth high country, and bears rarely linger in places without much food. And I think that last thought is worth keeping in mind. In writing about the first encounter of Europeans with the great bear, Scott wrote, so the smart and adaptable, almost always hungry bears tended to congregate in places where bison were already dead. To the alarm of the early explorers, this often meant the banks of the Missouri, which were littered with the rotting carcasses of bison that had drowned, been swept over waterfalls, or died in some other way. Grizzlies traveled long distances to gorge on it, and that's where the core of discoveries, laboring upstream in cold water, often through thick cover, understandably kept their eye peeled for bears, and almost every time they saw one, they tried to kill it. According to retired Utah State University wildlife biologist Barry Gilbert, who analyzed very carefully the expedition journals, Gilbert notes that it was people who picked the fights. White people who followed them, Lewis and Clark, took a similar stance concerning grizzlies: shoot first. And this brings us back to the Absaroka-Beartooth. When biologists talk about wildlife populations, they often talk about sources and sinks. Sources are places that produce animals that can, if allowed, spread out and occupy new ground. Sinks are places where animals die in disproportionate numbers. The Absaroka-Beartooth is a source. The mostly primitive land to the north and east is a sink. Plenty of bears die there after they get in trouble with people. And then he notes, bears have little choice but to spread out. Their survival likely depends on it. Scientists worry that grizzlies, isolated in the greater Yellowstone, will lose genetic vigor if they don't find ways to swap DNA with bears from other populations, principally the Bruins of the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, anchored around Glacier National Park and the Bob Marshall Wilderness area to the north. So that statement, I think, deserves just a very brief background. Grizzlies were listed as threatened in 1975. US Fish and Wildlife has twice attempted to delist the grizzly, both times reversed in district court, appealed to the district court of appeals, and both times the reversal was upheld. And the decision for both reversals of the attempt to delist was based on the lack of scientific rigor. The first time on the lack of adequately considering the loss of white bark pine a critical food resource. And the second time, more recently, inadequately considering the importance or assuring this genetic connectivity that Scott speaks to in his article. But dispersing for a bear isn't as easy as it was back in William Clark's day. The challenges connecting the existing populations in Yellowstone, shown, in this approximate distribution of grizzlies, to that to the north, again, around the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. Really is challenging. Scott writes, connecting the Absaroka bears to the northern population looks simple on a map. The crazy mountains aren't that far. The castles and the big belts then stretch almost to the NCDE. It's mostly public land all that way, but barriers loom, 2 interstate highways and a ton of smaller roads. The Yellowstone and Missouri rivers, sheep and dogs, pig farms and orchards, and the whole range of temptations that can place a bear in a barrel trap or in the crosshairs. As a sidebar, Scott finishes his article with the story of the orphan bears of Tom Minor. After losing their mother during the first summer, orphan grizzly twins beat the odds and survived for 2 years in Montana's Tom Minor Basin, in large part because ranchers there have found ways to coexist with large carnivores. However, when the cubs found their way to the sprawling rural subdivisions of South Glastonbury, people grew alarmed and government officials killed the bears. As rural subdivisions proliferate, they create major obstacles for traveling grizzlies and other wildlife. So the question I'd pose is, have we learned anything since this event in Glastonbury? It was spring 2019, a couple of years ago. I'd look to a story that has recently played out quite literally outside my bedroom window. I first became aware of a situation September 27th when a neighbor posted a sort of ghostly trail cam image of what appeared to be a grizzly bear. A few days later, the Mammoth Gardener community bulletin board posted this photo, and just up the road from us were a couple of elk that had been hit on Highway 89, and this shows the feeding that this bear was doing on the elk that had been hit. So 2 things I think are important to note. First of all, the roadkill along 89 provides an attractant which tends to hold bears in these dangerous places. And the second is it's a danger in itself, the road, to a grizzly, the same sorts of things that Scott was pointing out in the map of the connections, the corridors between the ABW and the Northern Continental Divide. Trying to get a video started here and not seeming to have great success. At any rate, perhaps most people have seen this. Brad Orsted took a video of the bears in the green boxes over by Chico, climbing out of it at night with trash. So other attractant. Sorry, this video won't play. I apologize for that. Ah, there we go. So this was obviously not a good situation, and this video is pretty much gone viral. At least I've seen it a lot in my social media connections. But there are solutions. If you take a look over at where we spend winters in Cook, the situation in Cook was really more difficult in many ways than in Paradise Valley here. Rather than being a sink, something that Grizzlies hopefully will be passing through, Cook City sits in the heart of some of the most favorable habitat for grizzlies in the entire greater Yellowstone. And there were serious problems there with, potential conflicts between people and bears. And through the community effort, effective compactor facility was built. It is not only the trash compactor, it's kind of a nice little local art center and lending library. But, solutions don't have to be as elaborate as the Cook City dump, which we jokingly referred to as the most spectacular scenic dump in the world, and maybe it is. But just the securing the gates, the fences around the green boxes in Paradise Valley, which is being addressed from the Billings Gazette. Park County officials said the gate was not closed at night due to costs. After this incident, the county plans to run electric wire around the top of the fence and install an automatic gate to prevent bears or other wildlife from accessing the dumpsters. That process could take weeks depending on availability of contractors. But Park County is stepping up to the plate to address the issue of trying to get bears through this corridor. And it's left to community members to follow, that example, and that's being done. The other issue of the barrier of roads, I've seen, you often see the example of this really elaborate overpass up by Banff, but things really don't need to be this extreme or expensive. There's a photograph here I took from the internet from some of Lance Craighead's work that shows a bear just crossing with a culvert. And the photograph of Lance Craighead with Doug Peacock on Mission Creek, the existing corridor, the pass of Mission Creek under the interstate could be utilized and is being considered. So, for exactly that reason, there's a recent award-winning video, Beast of Our Times, that talks about this very situation. So it does appear to me that lessons are being learned. There is more concern. Perhaps the story of the two bears in Paradise Valley is not definitively played out, but I haven't seen any reference to them in several days. Hopefully these two bears are back up looking for a denning site, and Scott characterizes as the safest place in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem for grizzlies. So, and the whole issue of borders and boundaries and wildlife is not restricted to bears. Obviously, this is a map of migration routes for elk, same sort of thing for mule deer. And, in the valley here, I wish we had a map that would show the migration routes for pronghorn, because all of these are real issues. And there are groups, local groups that are addressing this issue. I would just point out as far as protecting the wilderness area itself, the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness Foundation, Craighead Institute, which I've already mentioned, Yellowstone Safe Passages, Park County Environmental Council, say the Yellowstone Grizzlies, and the Greater Yellowstone Coalition are all organizations that are addressing the issue of boundaries that are really barriers and ways we can facilitate wildlife use of this wild area. So I'll end by just pointing out this map of roads, which I think really has a couple of important things to say. I think most importantly is we do live in a really special place, and you know, it's important that it's most important to enjoy it. I think the Ed Abbey's quote of "It is not enough to fight for the land; it is even more important to enjoy it while you can, while it's still here." So I think the enjoyment should come with some reverence and respect because of our unique geographic location in Park County. We're in some sense the first responders, you know, to securing safe passages that would connect perhaps not only the Greater Yellowstone with the Northern Continental Divide, but the whole vision of Yellowstone to Yukon. So I think there are really two objectives in what I've tried to indicate on this, this talk about borders and boundaries, is protect the empty places on the map. It's really important to, you know, maintain the sustainability, but it's also important, and the real challenge is to provide security in protected and connecting these protected source areas to encourage movement through and use of the sink areas that connect them. So it's a precious gift, but if we are to really maintain the sustainability and the ecological health of these special areas, that's something we need to address in a very proactive way. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions or comments from people participating this evening.
Jesse, thanks so much for that fascinating overview of the three different stories, but three very connected stories. And I think we all really appreciated how you pulled it together. There were three questions that came in. One of them is a very broad question, and we'll start with that one, and then a couple of specific ones. So the broad question, first of all, was a compliment. Great presentation. What do you feel is the greatest threat to the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness area, and what is the #1 way that we can help?
Well, I guess I would pick just the press of humankind. And, you know, I think Trouty's quote I read from the introduction is really the way to address that. You know, wilderness and wildness is just not another playground or another a gym, an outdoor gym. And we really need to build respect and reverence. And we tried to do that with the stories in our capstone, the Voices of Yellowstone, Yellowstone's capstone. It's not a guidebook for sure, and we didn't intend that. And so I think it's just the press of people, press of development, and building the reverence and respect to maintain what little we have of these precious wild places.
Great. We appreciate you listing the organizations that people might want to get involved with to help as well. So thank you.
Yeah, there are people that are really concerned in our area.
The other really specific question was really your opening slide, and it was that image of Scott McMillan holding bobcat or lynx. And the specific question is, what is the story behind the photo with the cute kitty?
Yeah, I wonder if Scott's online. Perhaps that was a photo of Scott, holding a lynx. And I'm interested. I have not heard that story.
Okay.
And knowing Scott, it would be a good one.
I have a question from a biologist, a mutual friend of ours, who knows of your expertise in whitebark pine. And he asked, do you still believe that mountain pine beetle in whitebark pine is still accelerating under regional climate conditions?
Well, it's interesting, and the answer is I think that there's maybe a little background to this question, that the mountain pine beetle is a native insect, but with the historic climate was restricted to lower elevation forest, and whitebark pine strategy has been to escape to these higher elevations where they avoid competition from other conifers, but also avoid pests like the mountain pine beetle. But with a warming climate, the beetle was able to move up in a major way into these previous pretty inhospitable habitats with devastating consequences. Perhaps 80% of the whitebark pine in the greater Yellowstone has been lost due to a combination of the 88 fires, an introduced pathogen blister rust, and most significantly in this area at least, the mountain pine beetle. So it was a major impact. Like I say, somewhere around 80% of our whitebark was lost. And whitebark is really both a foundation and a keystone species. So it's a big deal. And it's a big deal for grizzly bears. It was the most important food resource for grizzlies. So that outbreak occurred beginning around shortly after the turn of this century, 2003 or so. And in 2007, there was an unusual early season weather event that pretty much shut down the mountain pine beetle outbreak. The beetle's really resistant to freezing temperatures in midwinter, but in the beginning of winter, when they really haven't acclimated to cold, they're pretty susceptible. So that pretty much shut down the outbreak. Plus, the beetle had eaten itself out of house and home in many areas. They're just, the mature trees they focus had been eliminated. So the immediate outbreak is, pretty much in remission, but the temperature and the climate habitat for the beetles is still improving. It's something that, I would view it as in remission. It's not something that's gone away. And when conditions, the mountain pine beetle is an episodic beetle outbreaks. And when conditions are right, it's going to take off again in whitebark. So it's not out of the woods for sure. And that's another story that's really important, a role that the Absaroka-Beartooth wilderness plays. It's probably the best hope for whitebark anywhere in the world. Most mountains are a cone. So as you move up in elevation with warming climate, you lose area. But the Beartooth is this vast plateau above 10,000 feet, already has Krumholtz whitebark. So it's really an important area with this. So I guess that's a long answer to the short answer was, yeah, it's in remission, but it's not, it's something we're going to face again in the future.
Thank you. Jesse, got lots of compliments on this program from people that I'm sure, and others, and you'll have a chance to read those since we're not, sharing who's saying what. But we did have another question that came in, and that is, what effects do you anticipate from extended periods of drought on the natural resources of the AB wilderness?
Ooh, That, that's something that I've thought about a lot with climate change. When I was working for the Forest Service, that was really my main interest. And beginning about 30 years ago with the first IPCC report, was considering what climate change meant for these forests, and particularly these high elevation forests. And the model predictions from the very beginning have really been quite accurate as far as increasing temperature. There's not ambiguity. They're not so consistent in the predictions of what's going to happen with moisture patterns. It's going to be warmer for sure, and it's going to be drier some places for sure, but maybe not others. So there's some uncertainty, more uncertainty with the drought, future drought. But if I would be really hard pressed to, having no crystal ball, it seems like they're, as far as the forest ecosystems, I think Doug fir and aspen are going to perhaps expand range with drought. One aspen regenerated species, and just the Doug fir is so adaptive. You see it all the way from essentially the edges of the sage steppe clear up to the highest, elevations. So, I think there'll be a general shift upward in the ecosystems. The shrub steppe will increase. I think there's probably not much question of that. The forested ecosystems, I think we're going to shift upward shift in lodgepole, but I think probably aspen and Doug fir are going to increase their range. And I hope we'll be able to maintain white bark pine on the landscape to get through what might be a prolonged tough time for the species that's adapted to harsh cold conditions. I wish I had a crystal ball. Unfortunately, the best we had with predicting impacts of climate change 30 years ago have been pretty borne out. We're seeing the things happen. The only real surprise is they're happening faster than I think anyone really anticipated.
I also have a question about wolves. This person is asking if the problems that wolves face are similar to the ones that you mentioned about bears in terms of habitat and boundaries.
Well, I don't think you can draw parallels between wolves and bears. They're really ecologically, they're such different. You're comparing grizzlies that have the second slowest reproductive rate of any North American mammal to wolves that are pretty darn resilient. And, there are always, the issues with boundaries are universal, I think, with wildlife, particularly large charismatic animals, and both herbivores and the predators, the carnivores. But beyond that, I think you'd be on thin ice drawing too many parallels. And, the whole issue with wolves is so loaded emotionally and politically that, I couldn't do justice in answering a question that would, I'm not sure I could do justice in the full presentation. But, I think they're really pretty different organisms with different ecological and habitat needs. So that's a non-answer. Sorry about that.
Here's another one that is, I think, interesting to a lot of people. The comment is, first of all, that the AB Wilderness book is so stellar. And the person wonders what contributors, Jesse, you thought were you were most thrilled to have on board for that project. And are there any voices that didn't make it in the book that you think we should be familiar with?
Oh, totally. There, I mentioned that just what a deep well of talent we have in this region, and most of the contributors, most authors are regional from the greater Yellowstone or a little further, Missoula, say, but and as far away as New York and Arizona. But there were stories that, they're just not enough space, and there are people that are so attached to this landscape and so committed to this landscape that there are many voices that we couldn't and didn't include. I think the ones we did are really stellar. It's a challenge in a talk like this to say, wow, which ones am I going to pick? But on the other hand, it's dead easy because you could throw a dart and pick any, and you'd have a really good talk. So, yeah, there are perhaps volume 2's down the road. I don't know. There's sure enough information. There are enough stories about this place, and enough stories and enough people willing to share. And I point out of all the contributors, this was all contributed truly, and all proceeds go to support the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness Foundation. So it was a big project, and people bought into it in a big way. It was really fun.
I don't see any other questions. Just want to remind everyone that if you have a question, you just type it in the Q&A at the, whoops, looks like another one might have come in. Let's see. Everyone's just complimenting your great presentation. But again, if there are questions, please type them in at the bottom, and we'll relay them to Jesse.
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. It's it's nice to be a part of this community. We moved up here after I retired from the Forest Service. We were living in Logan, Utah, and there was really a strong, very supportive community there. But it was really focused in Logan, in one town. And here I find, the sense of community goes from Livingston to Bozeman to Cody to up to Red Lodge, Billings. It's just really a regional community, and that's pretty nice as well. One thing I didn't point out on the map that speaks to the wildness of this place is there was a red. I guess I'm no longer screen sharing, so it's a little late. But the point that's furthest from the road is just south of us at the south border of Yellowstone. So that this is a place worth protecting.
I do have one more question, and this one is my own. I've noticed that the number of campers in the summer, and perhaps even users of the backcountry in the winter, as you alluded to before the program began, a real increase since COVID. And I just wondered how you think that has affected the AB wilderness and the GYE in general, and if you have any thoughts on how maybe that could be managed a little bit better.
Boy, I'm not sure I have any thoughts on how to better management. I think it's obvious to everybody that it's a real challenge to our overstressed, underfunded managers to deal with. Am I right? There were 1 million visitors to Yellowstone in August. Anyhow, the total, the backcountry use around Cook City in the past few years, but in particular last year, was really astounding. That's our 15th. That was our 15th season in Cook, and there were some real issues. It's really a miracle that no one was killed in avalanches. For whatever. I think the Gallatin National Forest Avalanche Forecast Center does a really great job in education, but when the number of people in the backcountry, many are relatively inexperienced, it presents problems, and it's a real challenge. and I think speaks to the value of organizations like the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness Foundation. One of the major programs are trail ambassadors, trying to interact with people, you know, teach minimum impact, you know, respect and responsibility, leave no trace, sorts of things. You know, there's no turning the clock back. Time runs in one direction. And I don't anticipate the level of use is going to diminish, but maybe the intelligence of the use will increase, and we can all hope to try and facilitate that.
That's a great way to put it. Couple of other comments and questions came up. One is, have you considered putting this on a TED Talk, your presentation? Or
I've been asked.
It's a great idea.
And you know, what's really, it's unfortunate. It'd be great to be sitting in a place where we could have eye-to-eye, you know, contact and interaction. That'd be great fun. But the advantage of this is it's recorded and available on the Gateway channel and could be used elsewhere, you know. So yeah, I hope this sees that this isn't the end of talking about the Absaroka-Beartooth and promoting wilderness values, for sure.
Yeah.
We were also asked where the book can be purchased, and I know that we have some copies of the book at the Yellowstone Gateway Museum in Livingston. It's also available at Elk River Books, Saxon Friar, now Chirpin, with other places, Jesse, in our area.
Yeah, well, you know, regionally, looking at this regional community, we've got pretty good coverage in the local independent bookstores and all the gateway communities and further. So it's a book we chose not to put on Amazon. Our intent really is to build a sense of community, and we really, you know, appreciate what the local bookstores and booksellers and other outlets like Dan Bailey's in Livingston as well carries the book. And you can buy the book online, go to the ABWF website, and there is a very direct connection. So, you know, it is available to a broader community, but, you know, there's good coverage in our the regional bookstores and other tourist outlets. I'm glad the Gateway Museum is carrying it now. That's great.
Yeah, we are too. Well, are there any other questions, Diane, that you see?
No, a few people chimed in and just affirming that there were nearly 1 million visitors in Yellowstone in August and 1 million in July and over 4 million in 2021. So I think your comment about, you know, being wiser about or more intelligent about visiting is a good one.
Yeah, I agree. So Jesse, I guess it's time for us to say goodnight. Unless there's anything else you'd like to add.
No, I think yeah.
Okay. We really want to thank you for a wonderful program, and thanks to all of you who are watching from home. Please remember to register for upcoming programs on our website, or there's always links on Facebook. And then as soon as I can, I'll get the program uploaded to YouTube, definitely by tomorrow morning. So until our next program with Mary Murphy on November 10th, I wish you all a very good night. And thank you, Jesse.
Thank you, Jesse.
Good night. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.